Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. We're going to dive into a new style of video, one that I have kind of taken from one of my favorite hockey YouTubers, the Hockey Guy. He does something that he calls the Panic Index from time to time. And after the All-Star week, we only had a couple of games, and normally tonight is the power ranking. So I thought, not really much going on to be able to talk the power rankings. Not really a lot switching, maybe a couple of teams. But instead, we're going to go over all the 30 teams. That is going to stay the same. I'm going to rank them basically on if they are in major panic mode, they're going to be down in the bottom left corner. Teams that are underperforming massively, the fan bases are just going crazy. Or maybe in my books, they should be panicking. It's about that time. Top right, teams that are feeling good, coming in, they're sitting in a pretty good spot. They should be feeling good, and there's like no panic whatsoever amongst that team. Bottom right corner, team's pretty much performing well. They're not really panicking, but they're not like feeling good because they're maybe not on their way to the playoffs or anything. But next year's promise looking really good. And then in the top left, status quo, teams that might be exactly where we would thought they would be, or kind of underperforming, maybe on their way up to feeling good. We'll kind of go as we see here. It's the first time doing this. As you know, I only do one-shot takes. I don't really do a lot of editing. It's part of my style, so I'm going to just kind of go on a rant here and talk about all 30 teams. Before I do, please subscribe to the channel. We're on 1,500 away. We're trying to get up there by the end of the season. We'll be giving away another hat if we do. We've given away a couple of hats, given away some jerseys for the fantasy leagues that we run, and fun stuff that always happening in this channel. The whole goal of this channel is to build a community around the sports, football in the off season of baseball. And yeah, we're going to jump right into it. I didn't really set up an order whatsoever. It just so happens that the rank one team is the first team we're going to talk about. Just going to go off on a whim here. Philadelphia Phillies. Not a whole lot to talk about. They got to be feeling good. They're the best team in baseball. They're ranked number one, probably right where you would expect them to be. If there is a definition of a team that is feeling good, it should be them. There's probably no panic. They all got their eyes set on the postseason, so I'm not going to go too much into this team. Next up, I got the Oakland A's, and this is a team. They've been pretty much bottom row of the power rankings for a number of seasons, it feels like at this point. A little bit of promise at certain points of the season, and we've seen some young guys really start to set up. Do they have next year promise? I don't know if they really have the pieces that we're going to be talking too much about next year promise, but they're kind of like in between next year's promise. Not really panicking. If you're an A's fan, you're kind of expecting them to be here, maybe a little bit status quo. So I'm going to put them in the status quo mark, maybe leaning towards the right side of the board, maybe a little bit down a bit here, because I think next year promise might be a little bit of the case, but status quo for the A's now. So this is pretty much the reason I decided to make this video. I just got this new hat. I love it. I think it's epic, good looking Jays hat. And at the same time, as you know, if you've been a member of this channel for a long time, I am a Jays fan, and the Panic Index should have been full blown going for the Blue Jays for a long time. They're like the definition in my books of the major panic situation. We've been talking about trading Vladimir Guerrero, Bo Bichette for over a month now. The team just does not figure out how to win on a consistent basis whatsoever. I think as a whole, I speak for the fan base pretty closely, and it's panic mode. Like, what's this team going to be going forward? We're in the American League East. We're clearly the worst team right now, and there's no sign of getting better. What do we have? We don't have a lot of prospects to count on in the future, so panic in Toronto. Next up, got the Pittsburgh Pirates. This one's been fun. They've been on a tear as of late. They've been one of the stronger teams in the MLB. Started April very well, had a shaky May, early June, but they're starting to come. They're above 500 now coming in, and they had a nice winning series against the Phillies. Next year promise is a most definite situation, but they honestly are fighting for a playoff spot now. So I do think we're going to put them to the far right here because they're starting to feel good a little bit. Next year promise is definitely awesome there. Some of these young guys are really starting to come up. Brian Reynolds doing well. Skeens, of course, we all know what he's capable of. But I do think the Pirates, there's not a whole lot of panic here. If they miss the playoffs, there'd be disappointment, which I think is different than panic. So Pirates, definitely next year promise, high after what they've been seeing the last little bit. Next up, I do have the San Francisco Giants. And for me, next year's not anything looking good. Status quo, they're doing a little bit less than what I think Giants fans have come to use for. So I do think there is some panic going on. in San Francisco. Do I think they're on the very verge of being absolute panic like the Jays? No, but there are a couple of games below 500 now. The National League wildcard race is just like thick with like 8 teams that are between 450 and like 520 in terms of win percentage. And I do think the Giants are in that situation where maybe they need to be panicking because this National League Central seems to be a little bit stronger than the rest. But yeah, not too much else to say for the Giants. Next up, I do have the Arizona Diamondbacks. And maybe there was a little bit of panic early in the season. We know, having them being the World Series runner-ups last year, that, hey, they had a big shoes to fill. So can't really say next year promise because at this point, it's put up or shut up for the Diamondbacks. So status quo, they're probably a little bit above status quo. It's been pretty much, maybe if I do a little bit to the right here, a little bit past status quo for the Diamondbacks. They're starting to trend in towards feeling good. They had a little bit of rough start. Injuries definitely playing a big role. The rotation wasn't as strong as we had thought, but they're starting to find their groove, and I like what I'm seeing, and they're probably leaning towards starting to feel good based on what we've seen over the past few weeks. The All-Star break is a much-needed break for some of these teams, and I think this is going to be a good one for the Diamondbacks. We're going to see them come out swinging. Next up, one of the bigger surprises, I think, on the season is going to be the Cardinals. So between next year's promise, I think there's a little bit of promise next year. I don't know how strong it is, but they're definitely feeling good. We'll just stick it right there. This is going to get a little messy as we go along. But the Cardinals got to be feeling good. They're in a playoff position at this point in the season. At what we saw in the first couple of weeks, first month, was not really looking promising for this team at all. There wasn't really any panic. Status quo for them, probably in my books, would have been missing the playoffs or being a little bit behind in this division. Although now that I look back at my division predictions for the season, I might have had them number one. I can't remember what I did for the Central. But the Central's very interesting. I think they're feeling good with where they are right now. Of course, there is a little bit of unease considering this NL Central is pretty stacked in terms of not a whole lot of teams well below 500. Pirates, I do look as having a little bit more potential in the long run. Next up, we have the New York Yankees. I think they're definitely not feeling good, and then we're not looking at status quo in that. So when we're talking about the Yankees, we got to be thinking they're panicked. And I think if you look about it, they're a little bit more panicked than the Giants. It's not been a good 6-8 weeks for the Yankees, and at this point, falling in the division, Boston series not going well for them whatsoever. It's a little bit of panic that if they lose one more player, Juan Soto, Aaron Judge, if they go down for a significant amount of time, there might be some panic there. We need to see the Yankees find some way. And I'm sure, I don't live in New York, I don't know what it's like, but I'm sure the media is all over in terms of that. Next up, the Milwaukee Brewers. I think if we forgot about how they got to where they are today and we just looked at the standings strictly at that, they'd be feeling good, but not like super good. It's a little bit of status quo. They're not doing anything too crazy to me. They got a little bit of a massive lead in this division. It's slowly been getting chipped away by these other teams, and there's 4 teams on them. They're going to have a lot of division ahead of them. I don't think there's any panic, and I don't think they're looking ahead for next year. Of course, they got some young guys that they're going to really build around in the future. They're feeling good. They're top of the division, so there's got to be a little bit towards that, feeling good. But at the same time, I don't think they're like feeling good. A little bit status quo, a little bit above that, but I think that's where Milwaukee sits. Next up, I got the New York Mets, and if you asked me a month ago, 2 months ago, they'd be definitely panicked. Next year's promise, probably a little bit exciting there too as well. But they gotta be like, they feel like almost like a smack dab in the middle kind of team, it feels like. I don't know how I'm gonna build this. I'm kind of building this as I go, but they feel like in the middle. Not panicked, not feeling absolutely good. They gotta feel good about the last couple of months, but status quo in that, just right there in the middle, I think that's how they go. Next up, Atlanta Braves. There's a little bit of panic here. While they're in a situation where they're on their way to the playoffs, and if they keep this up, they should be able to do it. They got, I think, a 4-game cushion in the wild card, something like that. But there's got to be a little bit of panic. So I'm gonna put it like down here. Like, it's not really too much panic. Next year promise is definitely there, dealing with the injuries, right? So that's really set them back a lot. So probably a little bit of feeling good next year's promise. That's kind of where I'm going. But we're going down a little bit because they aren't performing exactly where you would expect them to be. But at the same time, they're on their way to the playoffs. So maybe a little bit. They got to be feeling good with considering how things have gone and where they are. Next up, we got the Baltimore Orioles. And coming in this season, if you said that they were leading the division, their offense was going off the way they have been, there have been a couple of weeks now of not great offense, but on the grand scheme of things, things are feeling good. But I'm going to put them quite here, kind of lower down to the panic line, because there are issues that we see arise. They are floating around 600 now after being around 700 for so long, and a little bit of a skid there. Next year promises definitely could be over here even more, but the Orioles are sitting in a good spot. They're leading the American League at the very least, but I don't think they're feeling absolutely great about it. There are some holes that need to be filled. It'll be interesting how this trade deadline goes. Maybe I'll just move this up a little bit. Next up, I got the Angels, and like for me, it's like status quo for sure. Like they're kind of hitting exactly where you would sit, kind of like bang on the far left. Not quite panicked, because like, did you really expect them to do too much more than where they are right now? I for sure didn't. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. They might even be the definition of status quo if we really take a deep look at it. Next up, Detroit Tigers. Coming in this season, I thought they would be taking a pretty big step forward. They would have been strong in the next year's promised division. We've seen them start to make some decent changes, especially this past weekend. They kind of beat up on the Jays, but that's not saying much. I don't want to say they're a status quo team, because maybe their record's where you would think they would be, but I think they still want more. There's not panic, but there's like a little bit of panic for this team. Like the next year's promise, we'll put them here. The next year promise, that they're excited. They still think that this team can grow from this season, even though it hasn't been the best. Of course, at the end of the day, this team isn't even out of the playoff mix. There's very much in it. So there's promise there, and at the same time, there's a little bit of panic that they're not going to figure this out in time. Next up, we got the Minnesota Twins. It's been an up and down season for this team, but they've started to come out pretty good. I think they're in that kind of flow now where they probably are feeling pretty good. I don't think there's anything panicky about the Twins. Sure, they're not winning the division, but I think it's well within their grasp. Sure, did you think they'd be 550 at this point in the season? I think their aspirations were higher, but they're still got to be feeling pretty good. They're not going to fall below 500. I don't think anyone really sees that. Next up, we have the LA Dodgers, and this is where it's starting to get a little clustered here. They're going to be feeling good, but like at the same time, they're closer to the status quo line than I think you would want them to be. Not exactly blowing things out of the water as of late. They've went pretty crazy series here with the Red Sox, and a lot of these teams are starting to escalate into this little middle. I guess that's what happens when you build a little grid like this. Next up, Washington Nationals. And when I came up with this next year promise, this is kind of the team I thought about the most. So I'm going to put them down there in the corner. They're not panicked. Washington, I think, overall is performing better than almost everyone expected. They're above status quo. They're feeling good, so they got to be maybe feeling good and next season. But next season is definitely maybe a bit lower. The definition of being low and to the right for this team. They're feeling good. All right, next up, Chicago White Sox. This is like they're not status quo, except all of you guys seem to realize when I did my division previews at the beginning of the season, everyone was telling me I had the White Sox completely wrong. So for most of them, it's status quo. Is there panic? I think there's got to be a little bit of panic when you're the White Sox. It's got to be a little bit, because it was not a great season whatsoever. They made some off-season changes. They brought in some pitching. They brought in veteran talent to try to be somewhat more competitive than they are, and they're not there. So I think there is a little bit of panic. Sure, it's a lot to do with status quo. Maybe if there's like not major panic, move them over to the right a little bit. But I think there's a lot going on in the Central Division, and the White Sox are in a situation where they should be a little panicked, because I'm going to move them down even more. They should be panicked, because they're going to be the worst team in this division for a long time, and that's never fun, especially for fans. So it's not status quo. This is panic. I've changed my mind. They're panicked. Next up, Miami. It's going to be hard to really say much about Miami, because they haven't really had the chance this year. Some of the big injuries to their rotation at the beginning really set them back at the start, and they kind of started trading off and giving up early. So I would like to say that's just like status quo. Next year promise. It's hard for me to say if there's next year's promise. There's not panic. This team didn't really come into the season expecting to be amazing. They didn't come in expecting to run away with a division that has been owned by the Braves and Phillies for so long, but at the same time, is there promise heading into next year? I'm not so sure. It seems like at this point they're setting themselves up to be last place next year. So it'll be interesting, but it's kind of the status quo for the Marlins. Next up, Cincinnati Reds. However, they are last in their division. This division in the bottom four especially is within a couple of games of each team. Next year's promise, they were kind of in that category last year. I don't know if there's a lot coming up down the pipe for this team that's going to really put them over the hump of where they are exactly right now. Maybe I'm wrong. Leave me a comment below if that's the case. Are they feeling good? Probably not too much. So it's a little bit of status quo, feeling good, and promise next year. So I'm kind of just going to put them right there. I don't think they're panicked. They're very much in the playoff race. They're very much a very competitive team when it comes to this division. They're kind of just smack dab in the middle of this whole mess that I have created. Next up, Tampa Bay Rays. And this team is just always figuring out a way to get in the fight. It's almost status quo. It's like almost the definition. They're above 500, a team that I did not expect. Next year promise, it's almost like being an insult to say we're not expecting the Rays to be a good team next year, because every year they're at least super competitive, at least for the past decade. So a little bit of status quo and feeling good. I think they're like right there right now, because they're on status quo, because it's just like that's what the Rays do. They play 500 baseball. They have great pitching. Their guys get timely hits. They find the guys that are young and are very contract-oriented players, and they just remain competitive. The Rays are doing what Rays do. At the same time, they're feeling good because they're in the hunt, although the American League's a little tougher. Next up, I do have the Seattle Mariners. This is probably a 550 team. It seems like I'm mostly putting American League teams down in the panic department. I would say next year promise or status quo and feeling good, but the Mariners can't be feeling good after watching what they've erased in terms of their division lead. So it's not really too much of that. It's going to be a little bit of panic, a little bit of status quo, and not really close to feeling good, but they're starting to panic because the Astros have heated up over the past few months. They have a double-digit lead on this division, at least over the Astros. It's just slowly slipped away, and now this series over the weekend, the Astros taking that. Little bit of concern there as well. So panic in Mariners land, what can you say? Next up, San Diego Padres, a 500 team for life, and it's almost like they are definition status quo. Probably could put them a little bit lower. Are they panicking? Maybe not. They're kind of been in the same spot over and over again. They haven't really shown anything that there's to get super worried about. Are they going to miss the playoffs? Possibly. It's getting really thick in here, but as you can see, when you're looking at average of teams, you really start to build a line with some outliers in certain situations. But this is fun. This has been a fun one so far. Next up, I got the Houston Astros. I think if you ask the Houston Astros, if you told them they would be where they are today after the start they had, after what they had to deal with injuries, everyone would be ecstatic. So I think the Houston Astros have something really good to feel good about. Just going to move this over to the side, but the Astros are in a good spot. They're not leading the division, but I think by that, when all is said and done, they will be. I think they should be feeling good. They're not panicked. They've been like smooth operators the entire time, and it just seems to be working out for them. Next up, Colorado Rockies, and can't be promised next year. So, like, I just don't see it as a Rockies fan. Like, what are you really excited about seeing where this team is going next year? I think you could arguably put them in the same spot as the White Sox, but coming into this season, I think the main difference there is that everyone expected the Rockies to be poor. They're crap. They're not doing so well. I think now if we start looking at status quo, there's a little bit more panic on the Rockies than the Angels, and the Angels got to be at least feeling a little bit better than the Rockies in terms of that. So just a little bit of a shuffle there. But the Rockies that's an interesting story. I don't know how they're going to find their way out of it. Next up, the Chicago Cubs. And for me, it's a little bit of panic and maybe a little bit of next year's promise here. Maybe they got to be feeling a little bit good. For the Cubs, sure, they brought in some young guys, bringing some guys over from Japan who have been big contributors to this team over the past couple of years. And they had a pretty good spot in this division for the first number of months, but then wheels kind of started falling off. We saw them fall quite far down the power rankings in general, and it's kind of fallen to this point. They're not last in the division, but they very well could be by the end, and I think it would be major disappointment. I don't think the fan base should be too panicked with what they see. They don't have any of these stars like the Jays and whatnot who are really being belly up and considered. And they do have quite the prospect pool as opposed to the Jays when they got to do all that trading a few years ago. Next up, we got 4 teams to go. The Texas Rangers, and as World Series champs, they are definitely in panic mode a little bit here. I think they do at least have a little bit of next year's promise in their favor. They're one of the teams that's kind of like the opposite of the Astros. They had a pretty rough season in terms of injuries, really set them back, and they've been fighting, they've been battling. It's been one of the teams I've liked following the most, of how much they fought. I just don't know if they have it. And if I was a fan of them right now, I'd be a little panicked that this season's probably not going to work out for them. And that's okay, because at least for them in this situation, looking forward, I do think there is some next year's promise there, and I wouldn't be panicking too much. I'd probably put them similar spot to Detroit, and really they probably are more promised than Detroit. Although for this season in particular, I think there is a little bit of panic. Next up, I do have the Kansas City Royals. They probably are right. You're going to put them in. They got to be feeling good with how the season's gone so far. Very similar to the Pirates, except they had a little bit of a skirt the past few months where the Pirates seem to have been heating up. The Royals did have a pretty good weekend here, and next season I think they're going to be pretty exciting. Both these teams are very similar in terms of pitching strength. It's pretty interesting in that way. But the Royals, they're in the playoff race as well. Both these teams very well could get in the playoffs, so they got to be feeling good coming in this season. If they were going to be in the playoff race, you'd be super pumped. But they also have a lot of promise for next year, as well as some of these teams, right? Next up, I have the Boston Red Sox. I'm going to put them right here smack dab in the middle. It fits pretty well. It makes a lot of sense. They got to be feeling good. They're very much in a spot that pretty much anyone saw they would be. I had predicted them last in the division, and boy, was I wrong about that. Next year, that's the one thing I'm a little unsure about, whether this is just maybe a one-season kind of fluke or is this something they can build on. I know they've really wanted to test out these young guys. So far, they performed, but when I'm looking at young talent, the first season, sometimes they come good, and then the book gets out on them, and then the next season they have a pretty bad year. We're going to have to see how that works out for Boston, but right now they're doing all right. And that leads us to the last team on the board. I'm going to put the Cleveland Guardians, and for me, you could probably put them like right here. I'm just going to put them in this one spot that fits. They got to be feeling good, leading the division, 600 baseball. But it's been slowly getting chipped away. They've slowly been falling down the board. So a little bit of that good feeling has got to be turning into somewhat of a panic, because this division is not easy. We got the Twins, we got the Royals, who are right on their butts. And you got Detroit, who is hungry enough to be able to be on their butts if they really get their stuff together. Guardians end the season today, they'd be up higher. But we still have a lot of baseball left to play, and there is a little bit of unease on this team, whether they can keep the consistency that we saw in the first half of the season going the rest of the year. No time to panic yet. Like, lots of baseball. They're going to sort it out, right? But there you have it, the first ever panic index of the MLB. It's quite beautiful, if you ask me. Let me know what you guys think. Who would you rate a little bit differently? Who do I just have completely wrong on this board? I think it was a pretty fun video to do. I like doing these kind of videos once in a while. Power rankings next week. I'm trying to decide if I should do it on the normal Sunday like I normally do, but it would be live or in from Vegas. And for people that have been around every year for the past few years, I do one power ranking usually on my trip to Vegas. It's not exactly on the board as the format we normally do. Or do I wait one extra day and release it on Monday, where I would be back in my office, be able to do it this way? I'm curious if anyone has any input on that. Probably will stick to the Sunday, but just curious what you guys think. Otherwise, guys, thanks for watching. We will see you for that next video.